I Want to Be a Lifeguard from Blotto on Revenge of the 80s Radio, one of the first videos played on MTV back in 1981. We're approaching that August 1st anniversary, and with me now is the drummer from Blotto, Paul Rapp, known both as...
Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Hi, how you doing, Paul? You're known both as Lee Harvey Blotto and F. Lee Harvey Blotto. I like that. Of course, that's because you're now a lawyer, so welcome to Revenge of the 80s Radio, Paul.
Yeah, I changed it when I graduated from law school. I changed it from Lee Harvey Blotto to F. Lee Harvey Blotto. It just seemed appropriate.
It could have put a JD at the end of it, made it even longer.
Yeah.
Paul, how did you guys form Blotto?
The band grew out of the Star Spangled Washboard Band, which was kind of a hippie, high-end bluegrass jug band that formed in the Albany area in the late 60s and then toured for the next 5 or 6 years, played every folk festival and every college in the country, basically. And they just kind of ran out of steam, broke up the band, decided they were all going to get day jobs and live normal lives and would never go on the road again. And then about 2 months later, they started playing just in a small club in Saratoga on like one weekend a month. And at some point, they called themselves Blotto, and because they didn't have a name for like 3 months, and the club owner said, "You guys really have to have a name so I can advertise you." And then their previous drummer, whose name was Johnny Blotton, disappeared, and I got a call on a Thursday night, and can you come play with Blotto this weekend? And at that time, they were doing just a bunch of stupid '60s covers, and they didn't rehearse, and so it was just this really loose, funny, and they were extremely theatric and extremely silly on stage, and they were starting to draw crowds. And so this would have been 1978 when I joined the band, and it just kind of went from there. We decided at some point we wanted to make a demo so we could play in larger crappy clubs than the small crappy clubs we were playing in. And so we started recording, and at some point Broadway came in. I remember it was like in the middle of October, and it was freezing out, and we're in an unheated loft rehearsing, and Broadway comes in with this song called "I Want to Be a Lifeguard." And it just came together like, in 5 minutes. He said, I need a surf beat. So I played kind of a derivative of Wipeout, with a Hollywood beat on it. And he said, okay, here's the choruses. And then on the choruses, we need something after I Want to Be a Lifeguard, we need something. And I said, well, how about help, help, help? Why don't we, and he goes, that's it. And so the song kind of was fully formed in about 5 minutes. And I think that weekend we started recording it. We hadn't even played it out live yet.
5 minutes. That joins the ranks of Kid Creole and the Coconut Stool Pigeon as hit songs that were written in a few minutes.
I think a lot of the best songs are. I mean, they just come together, especially when you got a bunch of people contributing that are all on the same page. And we all were. We all had the same 60s influences, the rock and roll influences. So we all kind of knew what the other person was doing, sometimes before the other person even did it.
I want to get into that song, and Paul Rapp is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio from the band Blotto. I want to get into that song in just a few moments. Back to the band name. I always wonder where you got it from, because I remember the TV version of Animal House had Bluto's brother named Blotto, but you guys came before that.
Yeah, it came about. I mean, when the club owner, said you need a name for the band, Broadway was reading a book called Nightlife of the Gods, which was written by Thorne Smith, who's the guy who also wrote Topper. And it featured this magical dog named Blotto, who could turn inanimate objects animate. And so he just thought, he was on the chapter entitled Blotto's Tale, and he just said, well, let's call the band Blotto after this dog. And understand it, at this point, it was a weekend bar band, and the name, everybody said, okay, we need a name, let's call it Blotto. It was not a reference to the British slang, which means fall down drunk. So there were times in our existence that probably would have been an apt name, an apt derivation as well.
And certainly not the Laurel and Hardy movie.
No, I mean that's that's out there. But and actually, you can watch. There was a 1930s. I don't know what year it was, but it was a very early film of Nightlife of the Gods that I found on YouTube. I wouldn't it was pretty awful. I wouldn't recommend. I don't think the movie was nearly as good as the book was.
You guys took that new rock and new wave sound of the area. You mentioned a little bit of that before, injected the beach sound and humor into the act.
Yeah.
Was that what the band set out to do in the beginning? I know you said they did a lot of silly things on stage, or did they kind of shift into that niche?
No, we were always totally nuts and theatrical on stage. And that was an extension of the old Washboard Band. I mean, those guys, and you can find videos of them on YouTube as well. I mean, they were totally insane and theatrical. It was kind of like the Firesign Theater meets Flatt and Scruggs, those guys. And that just continued, with Blotto. I mean, the Broadway Bowtie and Sarge already had this kind of working on-stage relationship and this shtick down, and that just carried over to Blotto.
As far as the nicknames were concerned, why did you choose yours? At first, of course, was Lee Harvey Blotto, and we know where the reference is, but why did you choose it?
Well, on the Thursday night when they called me to join the band, they said, you got to have a Blotto name, and at the time I was listening to a lot of punk music, and I thought, well, I should have a real punk name, because everybody else in the band was, Broadway and Bowtie Blotto and Blanche Blotto, and I thought, a punk edge to this would be, a nice touch. And I was working for the state at the time, and I went into my office and I sat down and wrote out a memo and wrote like 10 different Blotto names down and sent it in a circulating memo around the office. And Lee Harvey Blotto was the unanimous choice. Although my favorite was Sergeant Blotto, but no one voted for that, so I became Lee Harvey Blotto. And if you had told me that 42 years later people would still be calling me Lee Harvey, I probably would have picked something slightly more tasteful. But there you go, showbiz.
There we go. Well, it could be John Wilkes Blotto. How about that?
Yeah. I wish I still had the memo. I don't think I do. It would be a great thing to have, just to see, because I don't remember all the other names that I came up with, but Lee Harvey Blotto was the winner, and so there you have it.
Paul Rapp is with me. Lee Harvey Blotto from Blotto on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Now, when we look at music history, not too many people think about Central New York as a great hub of acts coming out of there. But what was the scene like in Central New York, Northern New York, playing in the late 70s and early 80s?
Albany was great. Albany had a really cool music scene. A lot of clubs to play in, a lot of good players and a lot of good bands. There was a band that initially called themselves the Units and then changed their name to Fear of Strangers, who had a deal and were on IRS and did a lot of touring. And there's I could name a dozen other bands from the time, and Albany has had a great music scene ever since. And it was kind of, and a number of musicians have said that, we kind of, when we broke nationally, it really inspired a whole lot of other, musicians to, the realm of the possible. A band from Albany could make it, and did, and that sort of inspired a lot of the other musicians in town.
Paul Rapp from Blotto. Lee Harvey Blotto is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Straight ahead, we're going to talk more about the band, some of their bigger hits, and getting national attention on MTV. Metalhead from Blotto on Revenge of the 80s Radio. That features Buck Dharma on guitar. I have F. Lee Harvey Blotto with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. The drummer, he's with me now. I Want to Be a Lifeguard became a hit. We talked about that a few moments ago, and it spawned a video which would give you extensive national attention thanks to MTV.
Yep.
How'd you get that on MTV?
The year before, 1980, the record was released, and it got picked up, much to our delight and surprise, by WNEW in New York, which at the time was one of the most influential rock and roll stations in the country, if not the world. And they just jumped on Lifeguard in like May, and by June it was just a big hit in New York City. And so, we just happily, quit our jobs and started touring. And then some kids, like in early 1981, some kids from SUNY Albany approached us and said, well, we have to do a media project for our media class, and we'd like to make a little movie based on I Want to Be a Lifeguard. So we said, okay. And, picked out some locations and jumped around and did all that stupid stuff you see in the video. And they got an A in their class, and they were happy. And then they came up to us like in June and said, well, some of our friends in the media department just got hired by this company called Music Television, and we really don't know what it's all about, but they wanted to know if they could take a copy of the lifeguard video with them, when they go start their new jobs. And we were like, sure. It cost us $32 to make. I think that was lunch for everybody on the day we were in Lake George.
Now that's a budget. I like that budget.
Yeah. And so, the first day MTV was on the air, there we were. And it was something like the 32nd or 33rd video played, and it was really a function of the fact that, none of the major labels, very few of them were making videos because they didn't, there was no place to go with them until MTV came along. And so it, opened the door for a lot of lesser known acts, to get that kind of exposure, which was great.
Paul, I understand you became a qualified lifeguard after that somehow?
Yeah, about 5 years ago, I had started swimming for exercise, sort of on doctor's orders, and then I noticed that they were giving, lifeguard certification courses in the pool I was swimming at. And I've got a small lake. I live in western Massachusetts, and there's a small lake with a town beach on it, right down the street from my house. So I thought, at first I thought I could do this, and then I thought, I've got to do this, and I did. I became a certified lifeguard, and I was sitting on the beach in Lake Garfield in Monterey, Massachusetts for a couple of summers.
Paul Rapp is with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. We're talking Blotto because he's Lee Harvey, well, now F. Lee Harvey Blotto. How did the MTV airplay elevate Blotto's presence overall?
Well, it all of a sudden, we went from being really an East Coast band. We got sporadic airplay around the country with Lifeguard in 1980 and with our follow-up EP, Across and Down. But it was mostly college radio, and, it was, we'd hear that we were getting played in El Paso or in Seattle, but we didn't really have any confirmation. There was really no way to find out where we were getting played. And all of a sudden, we're getting played, nationwide. Although, it's important to remember that MTV wasn't, when it started out, it was only in a few outlets. And that's where the I Want My MTV campaign came from, because it wanted people to rattle the cages of their local cable companies to add the station, which they did. So, and we could notice it from 81 into 82 into 83, where MTV's exposure was getting greater and greater. We could feel it, and the geographical reach of the band became much bigger than it had been.
We played Metalhead just before this segment of the interview, Paul. How did you guys get Buck Dharma of Blue Oyster Cult to play on it?
We had just gotten turned down by Atlantic Records, and that's a whole story in and of itself. But, all of a sudden Atlantic started releasing all these hair metal bands like White Lion and White Snake and, White this and White that. And we're like, oh, they want heavy metal. Well, we'll do a heavy metal song. And Broadway wrote Metalhead, and Cheese and I were pretty much metalheads when we were younger, so we kind of knew how to make a song metal. And we stole riffs, right and left from all kinds of different people. But we were in a recording studio in White Plains, New York, getting ready to actually record Metalhead, which we had done a demo version of. And one morning, Buck Dharma just walks into the studio. He was doing his solo album, and he was looking for places to mix and to record. And I recognized him. I said, "Hey, you're Buck Dharma." And he looks at our road cases, and he goes, "Hey, you're Blotto." And then he goes, "I Want to Be a Lifeguard is my second favorite song of all time."
Huh.
And I went, "What's your first favorite song?" And he goes, "Come On Down to My Boat, Baby" by Every Mother's Son. And I realized that not only was, he a heavy metal god, but he was basically, one of us. He was kind of nuts. And so we played him a demo version of Metalhead, and he's laughing all the way through it. And he gets done, and I just said, "We're sorry we stole the riff." He goes, "What riff?" I said, "We stole the riff from your song Cities on Flame. And that's the main riff of Metalhead." He goes, "Well, we stole that from Sabbath. Don't worry about it." and then he said, "Can I produce this for you guys?" And I almost passed out. And, and somebody said, "Well, only if you play the solo on it." And he goes, "Yeah, let's do it." And so, he took, he took this song from a decidedly not heavy metal band, and made it sound like a legitimate heavy metal song. I mean, all the bells and whistles. And then he does this ridiculous solo in the middle. And then we did a video of it a few months later, and he appeared in the video as well.
Another guy who gave Blotto some really good exposure was the radio icon Dr. Demento.
Yes.
That's always a big deal. He had a huge national show at the time. He's a podcast now, still very popular, but I mean, he was all over the place at the time.
Yeah, and he was particularly fond of our song "My Baby's the Star of a Driver's Ed Movie." I think he played that one more than any other, and and that was really helpful. There's a documentary coming out about him, and I've actually corresponded with him a little bit. But there's a documentary in the works because Dr. Demento, everybody listened to Dr. Demento, but not that many people admitted that they did. It was like everyone's little secret that they were weird. They'd listen to Dr. Demento on Sunday nights, and that would kick off their week. But I mean, that was really, that kind of national attention was really helpful as well.
We're also going to play Goodbye, Mr. Bond. I understand one of your bandmates posted a recent video montage over it.
Yeah, that song was on our album Combo Akimbo, and it consisted of a whole lot of actually direct quotes from various characters in Bond movies. It's a song that's written from the perspective of the villain in a James Bond movie. He always has James Bond, and he's going to tie him to something and cut him in half. And, instead of just shooting him, the villain always has this elaborate way to get to get rid of Bond, which never works. Something always screws up.
But that's what Bond, it was all about. That's the classic Bond. You have to do that.
And, gives Bond a chance to live another day. And it's been, a real favorite of our live shows. But a few years ago, our web guy, the wonderful Bert Blotto, who does a lot of media work for us, went and cut little pieces of Bond movies and put them all together. And in some cases, the characters are actually saying, what Blotto is singing in the lyrics. And he posted it on YouTube, and I thought, this isn't going to stay up very long because the James Bond people are going to have it taken down. I mean, they are, and for good reason, incredibly protective of their intellectual property. And here, 5-6 years later, it's still up, which leads me to conclude that the James Bond people like it, because otherwise it would have been gone in hours if they didn't.
Yeah, they're pretty good at taking things down, or they're in recent trend of demonetizing things they don't like, but that's another 6 or 7 shows down the road. Right. That's also a different subject, but I do want to get into this because sadly, and it wasn't very long ago, that you lost Greg Hames, the lead singer known as Sergeant Blotto.
Yes, that came as a shock. I mean, he hadn't been feeling well, when we're talking February and March, and in upstate New York, nobody feels well during February and March. Everybody's got the flu or the cold or something like that. And, finally, and I saw him performing at a benefit for another, titan of the Albany music scene who had died of cancer. And then 2 weeks later, we get an email that he's got inoperable advanced, cancer, and they started in with some chemo, but he was gone in 3 weeks. which was just kind of devastating.
That is pretty sad news, and that was also kind of a young age, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, he was 66 or something like that, and there's his Blotto life, but then after the band stopped touring in '84, he became one of the most respected and loved rock journalists in the Capital Region, and wrote hundreds and hundreds of record reviews, and was a huge supporter of local music, and had a website called nippertown.com, which was kind of the place to go to find out what was going on in town and to read about both touring and local bands. I mean, he was just a huge supporter of not just music but theater and visual art and everything else. We had a reception for him 3 or 4 weeks ago, and something like 500 people showed up from all of the various walks of life that he was in, and it was really quite a stunning event.
Greg also got a nice shout out from Martha Quinn on social media after his passing.
Yeah, and Martha's a local girl. She grew up in Troy, and so when we hit, we did a bunch of interviews with Martha, and she, of course, played lifeguard all the time, and she still does. She's on Sirius Radio, and has a 1980s show, and she's still playing us, which is great. But she's just a wonderful human being. I used to run into her mom all the time at the train station, which in Albany, because her family is still around the Capital Region.
Before Sergeant Blotto died, you did play together on and off over the years, even opening for Blue Oyster Cult back in 2015. I guess a reunion of sorts there too.
Yeah, well, I mean, after Metalhead came out, some genius at a booking agent decided to put us together on the road, and that was the Blot and Blue tour. We went out and kind of stormed the Midwest with those guys, and we remained friends, and we opened for them in Albany in like '92 or '93, and then when Blue Oyster Cult got booked down by the river in Albany, we got the call, and it was great. That was our second to last gig. And it was just a great gig. We were in front of, 10 or 15,000 people, and it was a hometown crowd. And that whole show is on YouTube as well. If you look for it, it's the whole show and 5-camera shoot. And we were watching this, going, where were the 5-camera high res shoots when we were young and pretty, but. It came out, and it's a nice testament. It's just a nice thing to have.
That's why I prefer radio, so nobody sees me in high def. But that's a different story for a different day, too. Paul Rapp of Blotto was with me on Revenge of the 80s Radio. F. Lee Harvey Blotto, that is. And you're a lawyer outside of Blotto, specializing in intellectual property. That's a good field for a musician. What interested you in the law?
Well, when Blotto stopped touring, we were all kind of left scrambling with, what are we going to do now? And I had always had an interest in going to law school. And going to law school meant that I had 3 years to figure out, what I wanted to do. I'd be going to school, and I would figure things out. And the intellectual property courses were pretty much the only courses that kind of stuck to my brain. And so when I got out, I just kept looking for opportunities to do intellectual property law, and then the internet came along in the early '90s, and that kind of broke everything wide open. And so now that's all I do. I represent businesses. I do trademarks for businesses. I represent all kinds of musicians, all kinds of visual artists, classical composers, booking agencies, talent agents, you name it, playwrights, and it's a fun practice of law. And not too many lawyers can say that about their practices of law, that it's fun, but I can.
Paul Rapp, thank you for talking with us about Blotto on Revenge of the 80s Radio.
Thanks, Chris, and let's do this again sometime.
I think we should. Let's play another Blotto track. Goodbye, Mr. Bond, on Revenge of the 80s Radio.